What if the international organizations fighting for human rights were actually providing propaganda cover for the very terrorists they claim to oppose? In the Sahel, a region already drowning in chaos and violence, something extraordinary has happened. A complete inversion of reality, where military forces winning battles against jihadist groups are portrayed as the real villains, while the terrorists themselves express gratitude to the very Western media and NGOs supposedly dedicated to stopping them. This isn't a conspiracy theory buried in dark corners of the internet. This is a documented reversal of narrative happening in plain sight, and it reveals something far more dangerous than terrorism itself: the weaponization of information by powerful institutions. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to Burkina Faso and a young military officer named Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who took power with a promise that many thought was impossible, actually defeating the jihadist groups that had been systematically destroying the region for years. When Traoré and his military junta seized control in 2022, following an earlier coup in 2021, Burkina Faso was on the brink of collapse. The jihadist insurgency had metastasized across the country. Thousands were dying. Millions were displaced. Schools were shuttered. Hospitals were non-functional. The security situation was so catastrophic that large swaths of the country had become ungoverned spaces where Al-Qaeda affiliates and ISIS-linked groups operated with near total impunity. For the average Burkinabe citizen, this wasn't a political debate. It was an existential crisis. Their country was being consumed by extremism, and nobody seemed to be stopping it. Then Traore's government began doing something the previous civilian administration had failed to accomplish. They started winning military operations against the jihadist groups. These weren't small tactical victories. These were significant military successes that pushed insurgent forces back, reclaimed territory, and demonstrated that the security situation could actually be reversed. For ordinary citizens, this was hope. For the military, it was validation. For the international community, however, what happened next was entirely different. But here's where things get interesting. Because the moment Burkina Faso's military began successfully confronting the jihadist threat, the narrative from Western institutions shifted dramatically. Major international media outlets, the same organizations that had largely ignored the massive scale of jihadist violence, suddenly began flooding the zone with a completely different story. No longer were they documenting the devastating impact of Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates on the population. Instead, they started focusing intensely on allegations that the Burkinabe military itself was committing war crimes and atrocities. Human Rights Watch, one of the world's most prominent and well-funded human rights organizations, began releasing reports with increasingly sensational claims about military brutality. France 24, a state-linked French media outlet, suddenly became obsessed with the Sahel narrative, but not in a way that celebrated the military's success against jihadists. Instead, it promoted the message that the military was just as bad as, or even worse than, the very terrorists they were fighting. And they weren't alone. A coordinated chorus of Western media and international organizations began constructing a narrative that portrayed the Burkinabe military as the primary threat to human rights in their own country. This would be a normal part of accountability journalism if it were proportional, if it were balanced, if it actually reflected what was happening on the ground. But what makes this unprecedented isn't just that Western institutions were criticizing the military. It's that they were simultaneously ignoring, minimizing, or contextualizing the massive human rights violations being committed by the jihadist groups themselves. The narrative inversion was complete. The terrorists became the victims, and the military fighting them became the villains. Now, you might assume that such a dramatic narrative reversal happened naturally, that new evidence simply emerged showing the military's brutality. But what happened next proved this was something far more calculated. Internal communications from jihadist groups were intercepted and analyzed, and they revealed something stunning. The militants themselves were expressing gratitude toward the international media and human rights organizations that were criticizing Burkina Faso's military. They weren't angry about being portrayed unfairly. They were happy. The propaganda campaign against the military was helping them. Think about what this means. The very organizations founded on the principle of protecting human rights from state violence had inadvertently, or perhaps not inadvertently, become force multipliers for jihadist terrorists. When jihadist groups saw that international pressure was mounting against the government trying to defeat them, they understood what was happening. They were winning the information war even as they were losing on the battlefield. The narrative was being shaped in a way that delegitimized the one institution that posed an actual threat to their survival. This isn't speculation. This is documented. Militants expressed gratitude for the amplification. They understood that every negative story about the military in international media weakened the government's position, divided the population, and ultimately gave jihadist groups more time and space to reconstitute their forces. The information war had become more important than the actual war. But where did this narrative originate? How did such a coordinated inversion happen? The answer lies in understanding the institutional and financial incentives at play. When you examine the connections between France 24 and French state interests, when you look at the funding structures of certain human rights organizations, when you trace the geopolitical alliances that have historically existed between Western powers and extremist groups, a pattern emerges that's difficult to ignore. France has deep historical ties to the Sahel. Colonial history aside, France maintains military bases throughout the region and has significant economic and strategic interests in maintaining a particular kind of influence. When Captain Traoré's government began consolidating power and achieving military victories, the strategic calculus shifted. If a military-led government successfully restored stability in Burkina Faso, it would reduce France's ability to maintain influence through the security crisis that gave them justification for their presence in the region. This isn't to say that every journalist at France 24 is consciously working for French geopolitical interests, though some connections are deep and undeniable. Rather, it's to acknowledge that institutional incentives, historical relationships, and geopolitical positioning shape the narratives that powerful organizations choose to amplify. When a certain kind of story becomes useful for those with power and resources, it gets told repeatedly, funded extensively, and distributed widely. Other stories, like the success of a military government in defeating jihadists, become inconvenient truths that don't fit the preferred narrative. Consider the historical precedent. Western powers have a long track record of supporting, funding, or turning a blind eye to extremist groups when it served strategic purposes. This isn't ancient history. This is documented in congressional records, intelligence reports, and journalistic investigations going back decades across multiple regions. When you understand this history, the idea that Western institutions might subtly bias their coverage to undermine a government that was achieving military success against jihadists becomes far less conspiratorial and far more plausible as a feature of how international relations actually function. And here's what makes the current moment even more significant. The Sahel is experiencing a fundamental realignment of power. Captain Traoré's government, facing mounting international pressure and diplomatic isolation, began seeking partnership with countries outside the traditional Western sphere of influence. China and Russia became strategic partners. Military cooperation shifted away from France and the United States toward nations that weren't embedding human rights criticism in every arms sale or training program. From a purely strategic perspective, this makes sense. When the international community is delegitimizing your government while you're fighting for survival, you naturally turn to partners who don't attach those conditions. But what's crucial to understand is that this pivot, this shift away from Western alignment, was partly enabled by the narrative campaign against the Burkinabe military. By consistently undermining the government's legitimacy, Western institutions inadvertently push them toward alternatives. This creates a vicious cycle. The more Western institutions criticize the Burkinabe government, the more that government seeks non-Western partnerships. The more it partners with China and Russia, the more Western institutions frame it as authoritarian or anti-democratic. And the more that happens, the more pressure mounts on a government that's literally fighting for the survival of the state against an insurgency that would impose far more authoritarian brutality if it succeeded. The geopolitical irony is profound. Western institutions, acting under the banner of human rights and democracy, helped drive a government that was successfully fighting jihadist extremism into the arms of Beijing and Moscow. Whether by design or by consequence, this has fundamentally altered the balance of power in one of the world's most strategically important regions. The Sahel, which was once firmly within the Western sphere of influence, is now rapidly shifting toward competing powers. But we need to be careful here not to simplify this into a story where one side is heroic and the other is villainous. The reality is messier. Yes, the Burkinabe military has achieved significant victories against jihadist groups. And yes, there is evidence of some military violations against civilians, as there often is in any counterinsurgency campaign in a chaotic, ungoverned space. The question isn't whether those violations happened. It's whether the international focus on those violations was proportional to the focus on jihadist atrocities, and the evidence suggests it wasn't. The narrative war in the Sahel has been characterized by radical imbalance. When the military commits violations, they're amplified globally through major media outlets and international organizations with massive platforms and funding. When jihadist groups commit atrocities, which are often far more systematic, intentional, and large-scale, they receive a fraction of the international attention. And that attention is often framed in ways that excuse or contextualize their violence. This isn't about denying military accountability. It's about understanding that accountability narratives, when deployed selectively and disproportionately, become tools of power. They shape which governments lose legitimacy, which populations lose hope in their own institutions, and which armed groups gain breathing room to reconstitute their forces. The Sahel became a testing ground for this form of informational warfare, and the results have been devastating not for the jihadists who expressed gratitude for the coverage, but for the millions of civilians caught between military forces and insurgents. What happened next changed everything, but not in the way the narrative architects might have predicted. As the Burkinabe government consolidated power despite the international pressure campaign, as military victories continued to mount against jihadist groups, and as the geopolitical realignment accelerated, the fundamental assumptions underlying the Western narrative began to collapse. You can't maintain a story that a military government is illegitimate forever if that military government is actually providing more security and stability than the civilian government it replaced. This is precisely where the strategy begins to falter. In the short term, a coordinated campaign to delegitimize a government through media and international institutions can be incredibly effective. It can undermine popular confidence. It can attract international condemnation. It can provide cover for rival groups. But in the long term, if the government actually delivers results, if it actually defeats the insurgency and restores security, the narrative becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Reality starts bleeding through the propaganda, and audiences begin to ask uncomfortable questions about whose interests the original narrative was really serving. This is the moment the Sahel narrative war has reached, and it's creating a crisis for the institutions that invested so heavily in delegitimizing the Burkinabe military. How do you maintain that narrative when the military is winning? How do you keep arguing that the government is the primary human rights threat when the jihadist groups are being rolled back? How do you justify the coordinated campaign when militants themselves have been documented expressing gratitude for the media coverage that undermined the government's international support? The Sahel isn't an isolated case. This pattern of selective narrative deployment, of proportional imbalance in coverage, of institutional coordination around particular geopolitical outcomes. This is happening in multiple regions simultaneously. It represents a fundamental shift in how information warfare operates in the 21st century. It's not crude propaganda that announces itself as propaganda. It's sophisticated narrative management that wraps itself in the language of human rights, democracy, and accountability. Understanding this mechanism is crucial because it shapes how we interpret global events. When you see a coordinated campaign from major media outlets and international organizations against a particular government, the question to ask isn't whether that government has problems. Most governments do. The question is whether the criticism is proportional, whether it's selective, and whether it's serving particular geopolitical interests. This doesn't require assuming malicious intent from every journalist or NGO staff member involved. Most of them are likely acting according to their best understanding of their role and responsibilities. But institutions have interests, funding comes from sources with preferences, and geopolitical relationships create incentives. These structural factors shape what narratives get amplified, what stories get suppressed, and what interpretations of complex situations become dominant in international discourse. Consider the history here. Western powers have repeatedly supported, funded, or allied with militant groups when it served strategic purposes. This happened with various mujahideen groups during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. It happened with certain factions in Libya when the goal was removing Gaddafi. It happened with various Syrian opposition groups when the aim was removing Assad. In each case, the relationships were often obscured, justified through claims about democracy and opposition to authoritarianism, but ultimately driven by geopolitical calculation. The Sahel represents a subtle evolution of this pattern. Rather than openly supporting jihadist groups, Western institutions instead undermined the one force genuinely fighting them. Rather than funding extremists, they delegitimized the government trying to defeat extremism. The outcome, weakening the government's international legitimacy and pushing the region toward Chinese and Russian influence, may have been similar to openly supporting jihadists, but the mechanism was far more sophisticated and deniable. This is the new face of great power competition in regions of strategic importance. It's not crude military intervention anymore. It's information warfare, narrative management, and institutional leverage deployed by the organizations we associate with advancing human rights and democracy. It's using our own values and institutions against us, weaponizing accountability narratives to achieve geopolitical outcomes. The evidence for this narrative war in the Sahel is substantial, even if it requires reading between the lines of mainstream coverage. Look at the timeline of when certain outlets suddenly became obsessed with Burkina Faso. Look at the funding sources for particular NGOs and their institutional relationships with Western governments. Look at the documented statements from jihadist groups expressing appreciation for the media coverage that undermined their opponents. Look at the dramatic shift in geopolitical alignment that followed the coordinated delegitimization campaign. None of these pieces individually prove a coordinated campaign, but together, they paint a picture of institutional power being deployed in ways that benefited jihadist groups, even as those institutions claim to oppose jihadism. And that's the real scandal here. Not that human rights organizations documented military violations. Accountability for state violence is important. Not that journalists covered a military government critically. Critical coverage is essential. The scandal is that this coverage was selective, disproportionate, and coordinated in ways that served jihadist interests over those of the population being terrorized by jihadist violence. The people of Burkina Faso didn't need international media outlets to explain to them what human rights violations meant. They were living with jihadist insurgencies killing civilians, destroying schools, and making large portions of the country uninhabitable. When international attention suddenly focused overwhelmingly on military violations while treating jihadist violence as almost inevitable or even justifiable, something had gone deeply wrong with the institutions supposedly dedicated to protecting human rights. What makes this narrative war particularly consequential is that it occurs at precisely the moment when the global balance of power is shifting. The Sahel is resource-rich, strategically located, and increasingly important to great power competition. As Western influence wanes in the region, partly due to the reputational damage from narratives that delegitimize the very governments trying to provide stability, China and Russia are filling the void. This isn't necessarily a disaster. Regional autonomy from Western domination has intrinsic value, but it does represent a fundamental shift in how power operates globally. The Western institutions that claim to represent universal values of human rights and democracy have been revealed as selective in their application of those values, deployed proportionally against some governments, while being conveniently ignored for others. This revelation has consequences. It undermines the soft power on which Western influence historically rested. The Burkinabe government's pivot toward China and Russia wasn't ideologically driven in most cases. It was pragmatic. When the West provided criticism and conditions, while the East provided partnership and support, the choice became obvious. This pattern is replicating across the Sahel and beyond. Mali has moved closer to Russia. Niger is exploring partnerships with China. Senegal is balancing between multiple powers. The narrative war over Burkina Faso didn't just affect that country. It signaled to other governments in the region how Western institutions would respond if they pursued military solutions to jihadist insurgencies. The deeper lesson from the Sahel narrative war is about how information operates as a tool of power in the 21st century. We live in an era where narrative can be more consequential than military force. A coordinated campaign against a government can be more destabilizing than a direct military intervention. The institutions that control narratives, major media outlets, international NGOs, academic institutions, wield power that rivals traditional military or economic instruments. This doesn't mean we should dismiss human rights concerns or stop documenting state violence. It means we should be sophisticated about understanding how those legitimate concerns get weaponized for geopolitical purposes. It means recognizing that selective outrage, disproportionate coverage, and coordinated campaigns serve particular interests, and often not the interests of the people supposedly being protected by those campaigns. When jihadist groups express gratitude for international media coverage that undermines the government fighting them, that's the moment we should recognize that something has gone profoundly wrong with how our institutions are functioning. It's not that the coverage was false. Some of it was likely accurate. It's that it was selective, disproportionate, and coordinated in ways that benefited the groups causing the most human suffering. The Sahel is entering a new phase. The military governments that emerged through coups are consolidating power. The jihadist insurgencies are weakening but not defeated. The geopolitical realignment is accelerating, and the narrative war continues, though with diminishing effect as reality becomes harder to obscure. The government is delivering security results that populations support despite international criticism. The military is achieving victories that international media coverage cannot erase. The shifts in geopolitical alignment are deepening despite Western condemnation. What's remarkable about this moment is that the Sahel is becoming a test case for how narrative wars actually resolve when they encounter sustained, documented reality on the ground. You cannot indefinitely maintain that a government is illegitimate if it's actually providing more security and stability than alternative arrangements would provide. You cannot persistently argue that a military is the primary threat to human rights if the actual primary threat, jihadist insurgencies, is being systematically degraded. The narrative collapse is already beginning. Western media outlets that invested heavily in the delegitimization campaign are gradually shifting their coverage as reality becomes undeniable. International organizations are slowly adjusting their positions as the facts on the ground contradict the preferred narrative. And the populations of the Sahel, who lived through years of listening to international institutions explain why the military couldn't be trusted to protect them, are being proven right to believe their own experience.